What if the most civilized Christian kings of medieval Europe were built almost overnight out of Viking terror, stolen monasteries, and a treaty that paid raiders to become rulers? To understand why Vikings became Normans, you have to begin not with the people, but with the land. Normandy was not an accidental battleground. It was a place almost engineered by geography to be fought over. Northern France, what we now call Normandy, was never a distant fringe of the medieval world. It sat at the crossroads of power. Rivers, like the Seine, carved deep inland routes, functioning as open highways for trade, armies, and ideas. Its coastline faced some of the busiest sea lanes in early medieval Europe, linking Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Frankish heartlands. This was not a backwater, it was a hub. The land itself was extraordinarily productive. Grain fields fed populations, pastures supported cattle, and above all, sheep thrived here. In a world without central heating, wool was not merely fabric, it was survival. It was warmth, trade, and wealth woven together. To control wool was to control comfort, labor, and long-distance exchange. In medieval terms, wool was power made tangible. Frankish rulers understood this perfectly. For centuries, they treated Normandy as a strategic core, not a frontier. Monasteries rose at key points along rivers and roads. Royal estates clustered near trade routes. Sacred sites attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims brought offerings, coin, and prestige. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Places of faith were also repositories of wealth. Monasteries were not just spiritual centers, they were storehouses. They held relics encased in gold, silver, plate, coin, wine, textiles, livestock, everything a mobile warband could strip, transport, and transform into status back home. Seen from a distance, Normandy is not simply the stage where history unfolds. It is the reason the story exists at all. This land was not destined to be raided once and forgotten. It was too rich, too connected, too valuable. Normandy was the prize, and once the Vikings recognized that, everything that followed became inevitable. For the people of northern France, Viking violence once felt like a season. It arrived with the summer, as predictable as storms. Longships appeared without warning, struck fast, and vanished just as quickly. Farms burned, monasteries were stripped bare. Then winter came, the rivers froze, and the danger seemed to recede. Communities rebuilt, prayers were offered, hope returned that the next year might be different. But the pattern did not hold. By the middle of the 9th century, something fundamental changed. Scandinavian raiders began to stay through the winter, and that single decision transformed everything. To overwinter was to stop being a passing threat and become a permanent presence. The Vikings were no longer a raid on the horizon, they were now part of the landscape itself. When you remain, you learn. You discover which roads matter and which rivers lead deepest inland. You learn who controls the gates, who commands loyalty, and which towns cannot coordinate a defense. You identify rival leaders, old grudges, and weak alliances. Knowledge becomes as powerful as the sword. At the same time, the Frankish world was breaking apart. Kings fought their own nobles. Civil wars drained treasuries and manpower. Authority fractured into local strongmen, each protecting his own interests. In this political chaos, there was no unified response, only negotiation, betrayal, and exhaustion. And the Vikings adapted. Their strategy evolved from simple plunder into something colder and more calculated. The goal was no longer to take what could be carried away in a single season. The new objective was control. First, take the river. Rivers were lifelines, trade routes, supply lines, communication arteries. Control the river, and you control movement. Then, take the surrounding region. Make yourself unavoidable. And finally, force the land itself to pay, not to fight you, but to make you stop. At that moment, Viking violence ceased to be a recurring nightmare. It became a system, and once violence becomes a system, conquest is no longer a question of if, only when. To understand Viking success, we have to discard the idea that their power came only from violence. Swords mattered, but engineering mattered more. The Viking longship was not just a vessel. It was a revolution in mobility. Every element of its design served a purpose. Light enough to be hauled onto a beach by hand, strong enough to survive the open North Atlantic, shallow enough to slip upriver into places that believed themselves protected by distance. That shallow draft changed the rules of war. Rivers were no longer barriers. They became highways. Cities deep inland suddenly found themselves as exposed as ports on the coast. But the longship's true power went far beyond raiding. It created options. With these ships, Scandinavians could trade one season and fight the next. They could arrive as merchants, leave as mercenaries, or return as conquerors. They could escort goods, demand tribute, negotiate alliances, or vanish before a larger army could assemble. Longships made speed strategic and uncertainty a weapon. This flexibility shaped Viking society itself. Leaders were no longer bound to a single path. A failed raid did not mean ruin. A hostile shore did not mean retreat forever. The sea and the rivers offered alternatives. Mobility became leverage, and leverage became power. When a violent, ambitious culture gains unmatched freedom of movement, the balance of power shifts. Coastal kingdoms struggle to predict where the blow will fall. Defenses are always one step behind. Resources are spread thin. In northern France, this pressure was relentless. Longships kept coming not because the Vikings were reckless, but because their technology made persistence possible. The longship did not simply carry warriors into history. It carried an entirely new way of dominating the medieval world. Viking attacks on monasteries were not acts of blind savagery. They were deliberate, calculated strikes against the most vulnerable and profitable targets in the early medieval world. Monastic communities were, by design, defenseless. Many monks had taken vows of non-violence. Few monasteries were fortified like castles, and those that were relied more on spiritual authority than military strength. Their wealth, however, was undeniable and dangerously concentrated. Gold and silver reliquaries, sacred vessels, coin, fine textiles, wine, and livestock were often stored in a single complex. Worse still, much of this wealth was displayed openly during ritual, laid out to honor God rather than hidden from human predators. To raiders who did not fear Christian sacrilege, monasteries represented the perfect equation: maximum reward at minimal cost. Resistance was rare. Escape routes were easy. Even when monks fled ahead of an attack, the structures themselves remained intact. Granaries, workshops, stables, and dormitories could be looted, burned, or repurposed. A monastery was not just a treasure chest, it was ready-made infrastructure for a temporary base or an occupying force. Yet the deepest damage was not measured in gold. It was psychological. Frankish kings justified their rule through divine authority. They were meant to be God's chosen protectors of the church on earth. When pagan warbands sailed inland, burned holy sites, and departed unpunished, that sacred logic collapsed. The question spread quietly but relentlessly among the population: if God truly supports the king, why can the king not protect God's house? Every monastery that fell weakened more than local security. It eroded faith in the political order itself. Viking violence did not simply destroy buildings. It exposed the fragility of a system that claimed divine backing, yet failed to deliver protection. This was the moment when axes and fire collided with ideology. And once political theology began to crack, the foundations of power across northern France were never quite the same again. Eventually, the Frankish rulers attempted something that still feels counterintuitive, even shocking, today. They chose negotiation. By the early 10th century, decades of raids had proven an uncomfortable truth. The Vikings could not be eliminated by force alone. Armies were raised, cities fortified, ransoms paid, but the longships kept returning. The costs were endless. The kingdom was exhausted. And so, in 911, after years of pressure and conflict that included the siege of Chartres, King Charles III, remembered by history as the Simple, made a radical decision. He reached an agreement with a Viking leader named Rollo. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte was not a surrender, but it was a gamble. Charles granted Rollo control of territory along the Lower Seine, land that would later form the core of Normandy. In exchange, Rollo swore loyalty to the Frankish crown, promised to defend the region against other Viking raiders, and agreed to enter the Frankish political order. A former enemy was transformed into a guardian. You can describe this moment in many ways. It looks like bribery paying off a threat to make it disappear. It looks like desperation, an admission that the state had lost control. But it was also a stroke of strategic brilliance. The Franks did not defeat the Vikings, they repurposed them, and this is the hinge on which everything turns. Vikings became acceptable, not when they stopped being dangerous, but when their danger became useful. The state recognized that it could not always crush external threats. Instead, it absorbed them. It offered land, titles, and legitimacy, things raiders could never steal by force alone. But the price was transformation. Rollo and his followers were no longer just expected to obey. They were expected to change, to adopt Frankish customs, language, and faith, to shift from predators to participants. What emerged from this bargain was not peace, but something far more powerful. It was the birth of a new ruling class, forged not by conquest alone, but by compromise. The Christianization of Normandy was not a single dramatic moment where pagan warriors suddenly became saints. It was uneven, improvised, and at times openly pragmatic, a long process shaped as much by politics as by faith. Rollo's baptism is often presented as the founding moment of Normandy, but historians are careful to point out how fragile the evidence can be. Much of what we know comes from sources written decades later. One of the few solid anchors is a charter dated to 918, which records Rollo and his followers operating within a recognized political framework. By that point, the arrangement was no longer theoretical. It was already functioning as governance. For the church, this was not naivete, it was strategy. Violent newcomers could not simply be destroyed, but they could be reshaped. Drawing Viking leaders into Christian norms offered a way to reduce raids, stabilize territory, and extend ecclesiastical authority. Conversion was not only the Vikings surrendering their old gods, it was the church choosing patience, compromise, and long-term containment over endless bloodshed. Faith, in this context, was something learned slowly. Even contemporary churchmen complained that newly converted Northmen slipped back into old habits. The response from Rome was telling: be patient, teach them, let belief deepen over time. Christianity was not imposed in a single stroke, it was absorbed, layer by layer, and when the Normans finally committed, they did so with intensity. They did not merely join Christianity, they embraced its logic of legitimacy. They founded monasteries, endowed churches, sponsored clergy, and displayed public devotion. Stone by stone, they built sacred landscapes that announced their transformation. If they were going to rule as Christians, they would rule as exemplary ones. Holiness became more than belief. It became protection. In a world where power depended on divine approval, visible piety was political armor, and the Normans wore it without hesitation. Within only a few generations, something remarkable and deeply unsettling occurred. The settlers who had once been unmistakably Viking were no longer Vikings in any simple or recognizable sense. The transformation was quiet but relentless. Language shifted first. Old Norse faded from daily use as local dialects took hold, blending into early forms of French. Marriage followed language. Viking leaders married into Frankish families, binding themselves into existing networks of kinship, obligation, and inheritance. Through these unions, former outsiders gained access to legitimacy that no raid could ever provide. Administration changed as well. Legal customs adapted to local norms. Written records, charters, and land grants replaced informal agreements sealed by reputation and force. The settlers learned a critical lesson. Permanent power does not come from what you can carry away, it comes from what you can hold. Land, not loot, became the foundation of wealth, influence, and continuity. Out of this process emerged something new. Not Norse, not Frankish, Norman. Norman identity was a hybrid creation, forged through adaptation rather than abandonment. Scandinavian instincts for mobility, aggression, and ambition were preserved, but they were now housed within Frankish systems of governance, law, and religion. The result was a culture both disciplined and dangerous, capable of violence, yet fluent in order. Even the way the Normans understood themselves began to change. They told stories about their origins, reshaping memory into myth. Founders were enlarged, lineages refined, and the chaos of arrival was rewritten as destiny. These narratives were not harmless legends. They were tools designed to make rule appear natural, even inevitable. And that is why the story mattered so deeply. Because when a people can convincingly tell themselves and others that they were always meant to rule, conquest no longer looks like theft, it looks like inheritance. In that moment, the Normans stopped being foreigners. They became heirs. Raiders can terrify, but terror fades. Rulers, if they are to survive, must endure. The Normans understood this distinction earlier than most. Violence had brought them land, but violence alone could never secure it. What transformed conquest into control was their mastery of permanence, the technology of rule itself. Castles were central to this transformation. They were not simply military installations meant to repel attacks. They were statements made in stone. Raised above towns, rivers, and roads, Norman castles announced ownership of the landscape. They projected authority long after armies moved on. Even when empty, they dominated the horizon, reminding local populations that power was fixed, watching, and prepared to return at any moment. Religious foundations served a parallel purpose. Abbeys and monasteries were more than acts of devotion. They functioned as spiritual insurance, ensuring prayers for the rulers' souls, but they were also instruments of cultural diplomacy. A monastery bound Norman authority to local faith, local memory, and sacred tradition. It embedded the conquerors into the moral universe of the people they ruled. Stone walls and holy chants worked together, reinforcing order from different directions. Then came the next leap forward. The Normans exported this system. Within the same century, Norman warriors and leaders carried their model beyond France. In southern Italy, figures such as Robert Guiscard carved out dominions through the same formula. Rapid conquest, followed by fortification, administration, and religious patronage. Wherever they went, the pattern repeated. Violence opened the door. Institutions kept it open. This is the Norman secret, often misunderstood. Their success did not rest on brutality alone. It rested on the fusion of two forces rarely combined so effectively: the raw energy of raiders and the disciplined structures of governance. They did not abandon their violent instincts. They contained them, redirected them, and locked them into systems that could last for generations. In doing so, the Normans turned temporary domination into enduring rule and transformed themselves from conquerors into architects of power. In the American imagination, the year 1066 often feels deceptively simple: a single battle, a fallen king, a crown changing hands, a clean break in history. But the Norman conquest was never just a day on a battlefield. It was a system, carefully assembled and relentlessly enforced. Long before Hastings, William's claim had already been constructed. Legal arguments were prepared, oaths were invoked, papal approval was sought and secured, transforming invasion into something closer to a holy mission. Logistics mattered as much as courage. Ships had to be built, horses transported, supply lines maintained across open water. This was not a raid, it was an operation. On the battlefield, Norman cavalry, discipline, and tactical flexibility gave them an edge. But even victory at Hastings did not mean control. It meant opportunity. What followed was intimidation, negotiation, and punishment applied with calculated persistence. Towns were spared if they submitted, burned if they resisted. The message was unmistakable. The Bayeux Tapestry reveals how the Normans wanted this story remembered. Stretching nearly 70 meters, it presents conquest as destiny guided by God, justified by oath, sealed by victory. But this is no neutral chronicle. It is visual propaganda, transforming violence and ambition into a moral narrative where Norman rule appears not only legitimate, but inevitable. Even William's coronation exposes the deeper truth. Chaos erupted in the streets, fires burned, fear spread. Conquest, it turns out, does not end when the crown is placed on a head. It begins there. To rule unwilling subjects requires constant vigilance, managing terror, manufacturing legitimacy, and preparing for rebellion at every moment. So the Normans did what they knew best. They built. Castles rose like iron nails driven into the land, fortresses overlooking roads, rivers, and towns, stone reminders that resistance would be met and order would be enforced. In doing so, the Normans reshaped England not just politically, but physically, creating a landscape capable of holding an occupation. The conquest of 1066 was not a moment, it was a machine, and once it started, it did not stop. Every empire has a moment when its true cost becomes impossible to ignore. For William of Normandy, that moment came in the north of England. Between 1069 and 1070, faced with repeated rebellions and foreign-backed resistance, William unleashed what history remembers as the harrying of the North. It was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a campaign of systematic destruction. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. Medieval chroniclers describe famines so severe that survivors turned to acts once considered unthinkable. Modern historians debate the scale, but not the intent. This was terror as policy designed to break resistance not just for a season, but for generations. The message was unmistakable. Defiance would be answered not with negotiation, but with annihilation. And yet, violence was only the opening act. Once the kingdom had been subdued, administration took over. In 1086, William ordered an unprecedented survey of his conquered realm, the record we now call the Domesday Book. Every manor was measured, every field assessed, every household counted, who held the land, what it produced, what it was worth. Nothing escaped notice. This was conquest, translated into bureaucracy. Ink replaced fire, numbers replaced swords. The Domesday Survey did not merely record England, it claimed it. By cataloguing the land, William asserted ownership over it in perpetuity. Judgment had been passed, and there was no appeal. Here lies the final, uncomfortable truth. The Normans brought change that cut in multiple directions. They helped erode older practices, including the widespread enslavement of Christians. Yet they also imposed an aristocratic takeover so complete that it transformed England's ruling class almost overnight. Language shifted, architecture changed, law was rewritten, identity itself was reshaped. They did not merely replace a king, they replaced the very framework of the country. The Norman conquest reveals a paradox at the heart of power. Order is often built from devastation, and permanence is frequently paid for in human suffering. What remains centuries later, castles, records, cathedrals, are monuments not only to achievement, but to the price that made it possible. And maybe that's the unsettling brilliance of the Normans. They prove that conquest isn't only about winning battles. It's about learning faster than your enemies. It's about turning fear into paperwork, and paperwork into permanence. It's about transforming from raiders into rulers, without ever fully letting go of what made you dangerous in the first place. So the next time you hear Vikings, Don't just picture a ship cutting through grey water. Picture a treaty signed in desperation, a baptism that starts as strategy, a castle rising in stone, a kingdom catalogued like property. Because history doesn't always change with a single sword stroke. Sometimes it changes when the people who once burned the world down learn how to run it. If you want more cinematic, deep history stories where ancient survival, identity, and power collide, this is what we build here on Prehistoric Shadows.